Good morning and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm really glad to see all of you here for the launch of USAID's Policy on Sustainable Service Delivery in an Increasingly Urbanized World. I'm Barry Pavel. I run the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security here at the Atlantic Council. And in this very room yesterday, we had our annual members conference, which was called A World in Transition, which looked at a lot of the trends that are going on in the world and what the United States, working with its allies and partners, should do about it. There was a panel at the very end, right at this table, right on this stage, with Zbigniew Brzezinski, Steve Hadley, and General Scowcroft, and they discussed sort of how this is a very different world, and I think even Steve said that the job of the National Security Advisor is much more difficult than it was during the Cold War, and that there were a lot of new actors on the international stage. And certainly I think this event here at the Atlantic Council is a good demonstration of how some of those new actors are cities and are people and organizations and entities in cities. And so at the Brent Scowcroft Center, we do strategic foresight, which really focuses on understanding how global trends are likely to impact prosperity, security, development, et cetera, of the United States and the global community. We do a lot of work on disruptive technology, on other global trends, and certainly on urbanization. And this work has been led by Banning Garrett, Senior Fellow, by Peter Engelke. And we also just hired the global brand of global trends, Matt Burrows, who will moderate the panel that will occur after this brief introduction. And so this is just sort of a sense of how this fits into what the Atlantic Council is increasingly doing on strategic foresight. So we have this Urban World 2030 project, which I think many of you have either heard of or participated in directly. This is housed within our strategic foresight initiative. And in it, we really recognize the central demographic reality of global urbanization. We understand that rapid urbanization is creating very swift change throughout the world and affecting a number of different domains. And so it's our sense that these changes have enormous consequences for sort of the daily job of what Washington, other capitals, corporations, and other organizations who play in the international space, what they do. This week marks the one-year anniversary of Hurricane Sandy, which ripped through New York City and the East Coast. And I think we were reminded once again how our cities are vulnerable to natural disasters and other shocks. In the aid arena, which is the focus of what we're here today to discuss, aid has traditionally been administered in rural areas, but urbanization is really forcing a rethink of this approach and of this mindset so that we can implement new, more innovative, more effective approaches for this new age. So USAID's urban services policy comes at a very appropriate time for us to broaden our thinking on international aid and development. And I think with the release of this policy, USAID has given all of us an important tool for understanding how the agency, how its stakeholders plan to navigate this urban world in which we are increasingly all living in. And I would add that I think USAID is ahead of its other department and agency colleagues in recognizing these changing realities and might even seek to impart some of this knowledge, some of this framework to other agencies that have to also work in the international space. That task alone, I think, is an important and daunting one. So without saying too much more, I'd like to give the floor to USAID Associate Administrator Mark Fierstein, who is also the Assistant Administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean. He previously served as Principal and Vice President at the international polling firm Greenberg Quinlan Rosner. He also served as Director of USAID's Global Elections Office and has worked in the State Department as Special Assistant to the U.S. Ambassador to the Organization of American States. Following his remarks, we'll have a presentation from Mr. Shadrach Roberts, who is Principal GIS Analyst at USAID's Geo Center. And then we'll have a panel discussion moderated, as I said, by Dr. Matt Burrows. The panel will include Jennifer Bradley, a fellow and senior advisor at the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings, Steve Feldstein, Director of Policy in the Bureau of Policy Planning and Learning at USAID, and Alonzo Fulgham, Vice President for Strategy and Sustainable International Development at CH2M Hill. And so without further ado, I wanted to ask Mr. Fierstein to come to the podium and introduce the panel. Thanks very much.
Well, good morning and happy Halloween. I had actually planned to dress up as a skyscraper for this event, but my good friend and colleague Steve Feldstein was afraid that one of you might tweet out the picture and it wouldn't convey the sense of seriousness that we like to convey at USAID. But I'm delighted to be here at the Atlantic Council with or without a costume. Of course, it's one of the nation's, one of the Washington and the nation's leading think tanks, an organization that USAID regularly turns to for advice and expertise. In fact, just yesterday, I had a staffer from the Atlantic Council in my office briefing us on a particular country. Now, our organizations have grown together over the years. We were both founded in 1961. Which means we're both 52, which of course is the new 42. So we are both young and hip organizations. And of course, in working in the administration, you tend to see council board members constantly, and it's hard to attend a senior level meeting in the administration without seeing a former board member of the Atlantic Council. But I do want to thank the Council for hosting and supporting this event. I want to recognize three people in particular, Barry Pavel, Peter Engelke, and Aparajuta Vadlamanti. They're just a few of the people here at the Council who have worked on urban issues over the years, and we're proud to be here to celebrate their work. I also want to recognize Alonzo Fulgham, who was head of USAID for a period and is still beloved in the agency. We miss you very much. Now, with the help of partners like the Atlantic Council, over the past 3 years, USAID has released 9 policies and strategies. I'm sure you've all read them all, but if you haven't, they cover a range of topics: gender, violent extremism, youth, water, and most recently, democracy, human rights, and governance. And together they form a library of guidance and principles that inform our development work throughout the globe. And I'm proud to be here today to add to that set the Sustainable Service Delivery in an Increasingly Urbanized World policy, also simply known as the urban policy. But we have a rule in government that if you can say something in more words than fewer, then do so. So we're going to talk about the urban policy here today. And in developing the policy, we pioneered a process of open policy making. So we posted the policy on the internet, invited comments from all over the world. We also held in-person consultation sessions with NGO reps, think tanks, our contractors and grantees. And we incorporated input from more than 100 people. And I think all that input has really produced a much stronger document with great breadth and intellectual rigor. Now, if you permit me a quick shout out to my USAID colleagues who helped produce the strategy. I think many of whom are here. Michael Donovan, Scott Doberstein, Elizabeth Bausch, Andrew Golda, Mike Kashishian, Denise Lamotte, Timothy Mahoney, Stephen Matsey, and Jeff Schuman. And I believe that they're all here. I'm not sure if they're wearing costumes, but they are young and hip. Now, we are pursuing open collaborative processes with other USAID policies and development, including our forthcoming biodiversity policy and an agency vision statement on the inclusion of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals. And we'll be looking forward to all of your comments and input on these policies as well. Now, this urban policy is particularly timely, and it defines, of course, a critical development challenge that USAID is working to address. Now, when USAID and the Council were founded in 1961, just 33% of the world's population lived in urban areas. Today, more people, just over 50%, live in urban areas than rural. By 2030, that will increase to 60%, and by 2050, 70% of the world will live in cities. 95% of this rapid urban growth will take place in the cities of the developing world. And in Asia alone, the urban population will increase from 1.9 billion today to 3.3 billion by 2050. So urbanization is clearly the future. And as development specialists, we need to take Wayne Gretzky's advice and skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been. and the puck is increasingly in the cities. As the high-level panel report on the post-2015 development agenda noted, cities are where the battle for sustainable development will be won or lost. Economic activity in cities today accounts for 70% of global GDP, and sustaining this growth is critical for meeting the goal that President Obama set out in the State of the Union address, which is that of ending extreme poverty. Now, urbanization, of course, offers powerful tools to transform the world for the better, but what we've seen too often is that urbanization has brought with it rising numbers of poor people who lack access to some basic services, clean water, electricity, solid waste management, or health clinics. And of course, now with global climate change, there are new dangers. As many cities are in low-lying coastal areas, growing populations will face increased vulnerability to flooding and other natural disasters. But we have an opportunity to harness urbanization to reduce extreme poverty and create resilient urban populations if we work together and take advantage of innovation and some of the most advanced technologies. And I'll offer one example of what we're doing in Kenya. We're working with a company called Sanergy that develops low-cost, off-grid infrastructure that provides safe and affordable sanitation to slum dwellers. Sanergy's network of latrines is then franchised to local entrepreneurs who charge fees for their use, and the waste from the toilets is then collected and converted into electricity and commercial-grade fertilizer. So with one simple technology, we're able to deal with multiple development challenges. Now, I think one of the most important things we're trying to do with this policy is break down the urban-rural divide. And urban-rural areas are increasingly interconnected. We know that rural poverty rates tend to fall in countries with higher rates of urbanization. And what happens in cities will shape the development community's ability to achieve our key objectives, whether it's ending extreme poverty, enhancing food security, ending preventable child deaths, promoting low emissions growth, alleviating conflict, or expanding opportunities for quality education. Now, over the next 75 minutes, you'll have a terrific presentation of our work in Kathmandu, followed by an engaging panel on the urban strategy. My colleague Steve Feldstein will provide more detail on that policy. Do feel free to grill him as much as possible. We enjoy doing that at USAID. No, but seriously, we are eager to get your input, particularly on the implementation of this policy, because we are confident that we've laid the groundwork for some strong work, and now the key will be implementing it in the field. So thank you again for the honor of participating in this launch, and thank you for collectively making USAID and our work much improved. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shadrach, and I'm from the Office of Science and Technology in USAID's GeoCenter. And I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about open urban data and why that's important. And specifically, we're going to be looking at a case in Kathmandu. For those of you that aren't familiar with the GeoCenter, we're in the Office of Science and Technology. We're geographers, and we use something called Geographic Information Sciences. We like to connect with people who are doing urban work because they're often familiar with GIS from urban, community, regional planning, and things like that. So I feel like I'm in a comfortable audience. We work to build agency capacity to use GIS. We provide mapping and analysis on request. We do a lot of work with data and tools, and we try and act as a hub for anything that's happening with geospatial tools and technology in the agency. So the project I'm going to talk to you about is called Open Cities, and it's actually a World Bank Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction project that we've been brought into, and we're really excited about our collaboration with the bank. And the goal is to build local capacity to create urban data and then to publish and disseminate that data so that it can be used by a wide variety of stakeholders. Our part in this is providing some of the initial primary data and source data that helps drive this process. In this case, it's providing satellite imagery. And then we're also organizing volunteers and organizing some crowdsourcing events to help do some data creation. And I'm going to walk you through this whole process in just a second. And then finally, to really talk about the importance of open data that a wide variety of stakeholders can use, not something that just gets paid for once and then locked away on the hard drive of an implementing partner or someone like me who's stuck in the Ronald Reagan building. We're working in 3 cities, Kathmandu, Dhaka, and Colombo. And today we're really going to talk about Kathmandu. It's a very, very interesting city. I don't know if those of you who have been there would understand that it's both beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The Kathmandu Valley is home to about 2.5 million people. It has an annual population growth of 5 to 7%. This makes it one of the fastest growing cities in South Asia. Very, very dense urban fabric. And right before I went on my visit, I spoke to some of the shelter team at the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. And their description of the city was really struck terror into my heart. And when I got there, and spent some time walking around, I found myself in this really dense maze of it's a very beautiful city, but you'll notice in this photo that the buildings actually bow in a little bit at the top. And in some of these alleyways, neighbors on the 6th floor can reach across out the window to their neighbor across the way to hand them sugar or tea. Sometimes you see buildings like this. This is the facade of a building which is literally propped up with timber. The thing about the Kathmandu Valley is that you have very, very poor building structure, not a very robust urban fabric, and it sits on a seismic fault. There was an earthquake last year outside the valley. It wasn't very big, but it literally and figuratively shook people up. There's a real concern that Kathmandu could potentially be another Port-au-Prince. So there's a lot of interest in looking at building codes and looking at sort of the urban fabric that's there. And this is the response. This is a local NGO called Kathmandu Living Labs that's funded by GFDRR to act as local surveyors, to go out and start creating data about this city that we can act on. One of their first projects was to map schools. So they had a bunch of partial lists that they were working on, and they began sending people out on the field on sort of these detective missions to find out where these schools were. So they have to navigate Kathmandu traffic. They have to wander around and ask people in neighborhoods, work from partial government lists. When they find the school, they have a survey that's done in partnership with the National Society for Earthquake Technology. And they start asking, how many students are here? How many students are here during the day? How many at night? How many faculty are here? After they've talked to the administration, then they go out and they do a building survey. How many buildings are here? What's the relative, what are the buildings constructed of? When were they built? What's the relative safety of them? And all this information is then brought back, and it's put into an online platform called OpenStreetMap. Now, OpenStreetMap is basically like the Wikipedia of maps. Anyone can go in and get the data out. Anyone can add data in. So all of these data are traced. The buildings are traced from satellite imagery, and then that survey is input as annotation into that track, so that anyone now can go in and pull information about these buildings out. So far, this team has mapped about 3,000 schools and health facilities. This is the first time that there's ever been a comprehensive map of all the schools in the Kathmandu Valley, created mostly by students for not a tremendous amount of investment from GFDRR. So the data are open. The USAID mission in Nepal has a disaster risk reduction office, and they're very interested in how we can use these data to better inform disaster response and mitigation planning. Some of the data are immediately helpful. First response teams could use these data to pinpoint schools and go check to be the sort of the first response in a disaster. But the Ministry of Education is very interested. They're looking at questions of service delivery. Well, now we know where all the schools are for the first time. So there's a lot of different ways that these data can be used. So where do we go from here? There's a lot of interest in seeing if we can map more of the city. Can we get just beyond specific things like schools or hospitals? So tomorrow, another colleague of mine in the Geo Center and I will be running a crowdsourcing event. We are working with the George Washington University Department of Geography, and we're going to have about 90 students who are going to trace a big portion of Kathmandu. We're all going to get online, and we're going to start creating these building footprints. We've done this in conjunction with that group that I showed you earlier, the Kathmandu Living Labs. And we're taking that sort of off their plate so that they can focus on field surveys and go building by building and start building up this library of what the urban fabric of the city looks like. We're really excited to be working with a bunch of different folks. We've had some great interaction with the urban team. Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance is interested in experimenting with this and seeing, can this help support our contingency planning? We've had calls from the Red Cross. Of course, the bank is very interested. And this process can be replicated across sectors. You don't have to focus on any one thing. And that's, I guess, the thing that I'm really excited about. There is a website up for the project right now. It's opencitiesproject.com. This is funded by the bank, and you can go there there, and you can see some real nice maps of things, and you can also download the data. Very simple, press a button, get the data. There's a lot of different policy intersections here. This is really a new way to go and get information, evidence upon which we can base decisions. So the local capacity to do that is very important. You have this citizen participation. By making data open, you are building in transparency from the beginning. If you have a project to build schools and you're mapping where all the schools are, if some of the schools don't build, that becomes immediately apparent. We're really trying to build in this urban resilience, both for response to disasters, but also for service delivery. And for, the data are open. We're really looking forward to having other people use these data and see what sort of things they do with them. So this process is something that we would like to see used more. And the GeoCenter can help USAID operating units acquire imagery, make it available to people online. We can help organize volunteers. The bank is going to be releasing a document very, very shortly with sort of a how-to kit if you want to fund local data creation. They're going to have position descriptions available, potential things that you would want to put in an RFP or an RFA. All of the training that we're doing for volunteers for this event will be made available online. So from our perspective, the goal is to provide sort of an open toolkit to anybody that wants to use this sort of local data creation anywhere for any sector. So we're very, very excited about being part of the urban policy launch. We very much thank the urban policy team, and we look forward to working with you. So I'm excited to hear what the panel has to say, and I will invite up Matthew Burrows to introduce them. Thank you.
Well, thank you again for coming. We're very excited to actually host this session with USAID and to peel back a little bit what is in the document, but also the different perspectives that are going to be represented on this panel. I hope what I'll do is give each of them a chance to talk a little bit about how they view urban world, and particularly urban world in the future. And then after that, open it up for questions and answers, and we can have a larger scale discussion here. I wanted to give first a view on how, from the Atlantic Council perspective, we're approaching the urban world of the future. Steve and I spent some time actually together. I was, as Barry Pavel said, I was recently in government at the National Intelligence Council and the author of a work that we do every 4 years there called Global Trends, looking out 15, 20 years. And, the last one was Global Trends 2030, published last December. And in that work, which we actually did with the help of AID, that's work, we looked at urbanization, and we looked actually at, I would say, urban world in terms of the intersection with a whole lot of other trends that we saw happening over the next 15, 20 years. So obviously, as Mark was saying, you have this huge growth, particularly in Asia and Africa, that's happening, over the next 15, 20 years. It's moving from 50% to 60 and on to 70 by mid-century. But what was particularly, I think, important for us is that this space contained both a lot of positives, and I would say overall more positives and negatives about what we had to worry about the future. So one of the things was obviously with the clustering of people, this was a way of when we were talking about individual empowerment, this was actually the means by which this was going to happen. So cities were the generator of ideas, very important for dealing with the global challenges. We also saw it as a way that, in a world of much more scarce, critical resources, the food, water is going to be a lot more in short supply in some of these fast developing areas. Cities actually were a way of handling this issue and becoming much more efficient in the use of these critical resources. And moreover, you know, it is a lab, an experimental lab. You could actually, when you're thinking about energy use, how to build cities more efficiently, here you're going to have that opportunity. Or, you know, a lot of the work on urbanization talks about not just the expansion of the existing cities or mega cities, but really the expansion of, you'd say, second, third order cities into major cities. So here they have a chance actually of building infrastructure that is completely up to date, much more up to date than we see actually in the developed world and with urban cities. So it's an exciting prospect. Obviously, as I said, there are negatives. First, the slums, you know, cities are a magnet. This is a way people from rural areas see for actually improving their lifestyle, their standard of living. But the first step, obviously, is into these slums. And you're going to see growth of slums. So that's a source of, obviously, social disorder. So how do you deal with these new migrants in? A lot of them also in countries don't have the rights of other residents. So how do you deal with their particular needs on education and health? How do you make sure that this is not a source really of instability in countries? So that was also a big part of the work and thinking about, you know, what does this urban space mean for the future? So with that opening remarks, obviously, you know, one of the things with working in the intelligence community is you do all this analysis, you throw out all these problems and issues, and then you give it over to the policymaking world to figure out, okay, what are the solutions? And I think that's also what we want to explore, obviously, with this document. And I thought I'd start first with Steve. Now you're the director of the Office of Policy, Bureau of Policy and Planning and Learning, the one who put out this report, formulated it. Tell us a little bit more how you see, first, this report fitting in with the other strategy reports that Mark talked about, and how you see it being implemented, changing the programs that AID has been undertaking already for development.
Great. Well, thank you, Matt, and again for co-hosting this event with us in a great space. And it's really great to see such a large crowd for an issue that, you know, over the last 10, 15 years has gotten less comparative attention as compared to other development issues. I think this really speaks to a large number of what we feel makes this an emerging critical issue, especially as we think about our broader development objectives and what we're looking to achieve. And I'm really also happy to be here on a panel with Jennifer and Alonzo in terms of the expertise and perspectives they can bring as well. So I think this is just great, and I'm thrilled that we have gotten to this point after a year and a half plus of hard, dedicated work with the community that's out here today, inputting, adding different ideas, suggestions, helping us craft and hone what we finally have here. It really has been an all-in product that is not in the least something that was concocted within the walls of AID, but really within the broader community. So I think that's great. And you know, as regards the question in terms of how does this sort of play into our broader development objectives, you know, I would say a couple things. You know, I think, you know, it really goes to why this policy right now, why urbanization issues, period. And part of it does, I think, very much speak to what you mentioned, Matt, in terms of the Global Trends 2030 set of issues, and the fact that there's an inevitable realization that urban issues will be a primary component of what we need to think about across a host of fronts. You know, whether you look at sort of the poverty reduction goals that we have, whether you look at linkages between markets and rural areas and our agriculture efforts, whether you think about climate change resilience, there's a host of interrelated challenges that we're anticipating that not only sort of extend to 2030, but I think far beyond that. And I think we view urbanization issues as really a platform to better understand, harness, and target some of those efforts. And so, what I think one of the first points we want to emphasize when it comes to this policy is that this shouldn't be thought of as a new standalone area that we're all of a sudden putting a huge amount of inflow of resources or attention. Instead, what we want to think about is really as an integrator that looks to what we're already doing but tries to deepen, enhance, and magnify that to a larger degree by putting more of an emphasis and attention towards the urban side of things. So for example, you can look at the three initiatives, presidential initiatives that we currently have that the president announced that we're putting a lot of money and resources towards. Global health, Feed the Future, the Global Climate Change Initiative, and I would even add sort of as a fourth, Power Africa. And it's hard, I think, really to imagine how those will continue and be successful without properly thinking about incorporating and ensuring the proper linkages to the urban areas are made. And that can be everything, if you take Feed the Future, from looking specifically at food security issues in urban areas, thinking about market access, market towns that are secondary cities, that are tertiary cities, thinking about transport links between agriculture and more rural areas and more urban areas, thinking about inflow and migration, thinking about access to jobs, and thinking about how those two balance out. We only have to look to our own history when it comes to industrialization, the process of migration between rural and urban areas, to know that A, it's something that inevitably happens, especially when it comes to modernization and so forth. And B, we need to be prepared to think about it, incorporate it, and view it as part of a broader system of interrelated issues. So, I think for us, even as a starting point, you could look there. But with the policy itself, and really is looking at sustainable urban service delivery within the urban context, I mean, there's a set of other issues as well that directly goes to many of the different things that form the core of USAID that I think are important to emphasize. So, for example, I would be remiss in not pointing to the governance issues and the inherent democracy, human rights issues that form part of that core. And so part of what we're talking about here is working with partners and local governments to enhance their ability both to foster citizen participation and inclusion in key decision-making processes, ensuring that development, when it does happen, is something that isn't just a top-down process, but really is something that reflects community decisions, values, and input. And thinking about longer-term sustainability as well when it comes to financing, revenue generation, and so forth. I think an important thing is you can't run a city in a poor way without sort of either adequate input or understanding of where it's going from citizens, or without adequate financing for key infrastructure projects, and think that you're actually going to succeed in terms of having a vibrant economic center that can get at some of the bigger core issues. Final quick thing I would say is that earlier this year in the State of the Union, President Obama announced an overriding objective in terms of eliminating extreme poverty with our allies by 2030. And this is really a call on something that we're taking very seriously as an agency in terms of what that objective means, how do we think about it in a significant way, and how do each of our different core sectors relate to and support that goal. And I think that the urban policy here forms a key component to that. That if we are going to get at the more marginalized and vulnerable populations in different countries, if we are going to really make a dent with our partners towards the extreme poverty population, thinking about the issue of slums, thinking about economic growth, thinking about access to services are all key considerations that I think form the nucleus of that effort. And so I also want to make sure that we mention that from the outset.
Well, thanks, Steve. I wanted to turn to Alonzo next. I mean, you've had your feet in both camps, so to speak, and your work at AID and now as Vice President for Strategy and Sustainable International Development at CH2M Hill. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how the private sector looks on this urban space. I mean, we, as I tried to say, I mean, have really carved that out as a new perspective, a new way of looking about the future and looking on development. So, and then what is the contrast between what you see, particularly in the public sector versus the private sector? Where are the places for really convergence and cooperation, where maybe there's some differences as well?
Thank you again. Good morning. And I want to applaud the Atlantic Council for elevating this issue at a very important time in our history. I've been out of government for about 3 years now, and I sleep pretty well after my previous job in government. But over the last couple of years, I've done a tremendous amount of reading, and this is the issue that really keeps me awake at night. Thinking about it from a private and public and private perspective. On the public side, I see the data. I look at the numbers. When you look at the 7 of the fastest growing economies in the world are on the continent of Africa, and 3 are in Asia. And if you look at the dollars that have been donated toward that growth, they all came from the taxpayers sitting in this room. And then you look at the population issues that we're going to face in these countries. And a lot of it is youth under the age of 25 and under the age of 14 years of age. And how are we going to address those issues? From a private perspective, and I'm learning to use that word private. I spent the majority of my career at AID working as a private sector officer, so I don't come to this situation newly. But I really understand the complexities of the issues that the private sector is looking at. How do we take advantage of these emerging markets? And when you look at the infrastructure piece, you look at the proactive urban planning and the good governance reforms, one of the things they recognize that if you have high impact public-private partnership opportunities, they're willing to take advantage of it. And where are they? I think the NGO community, the public sector have a great role to play in identifying those opportunities at all levels. And I think the way that's going to happen is that we have to change the paradigm on how we do business in these countries with the private sector. The private sector is not the enemy. And when you look at the infrastructure, the kinds of things that have to be done on the water side of the equation, on the environment side, the way that we've done these things and stovepipes have to be changed. You need an integrated, multidisciplinary approach. And I know a lot of people say, yeah, we know about integration, we know about multidisciplinary approach, but the issues are so much more complex. And the population issues are creeping up on us daily. I think somebody threw the statistic out that 180,000 people are moving to cities a day. And they go, oh, yeah. But you think about it, in Africa, everybody is going to the city because of what? The cell phone. Cell phone has changed the world forever in development. Before, you could leave them out in the rural areas, and they wouldn't be able to look at a cell phone and see all the things that they're missing, that they're not taking advantage of. So all those people are coming to the city whether we like it or not. And I think some of our programs that we've developed from a developmental perspective, the typical design and implement what they call a RFA, has to change. And we've got to look at incorporating cities and its infrastructure, its education, and its health programs in an equitable way that allows for those cities to grow and manage that growth. Otherwise, all those youth that we talked about become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And I think the biggest thing we need to be concerned about is how do we retain the gains that we've made. And I know that I would not like to see countries that are growing at 8 and 9% and all the taxpayer dollars that we've invested over the years go backwards. So I'm not saying the private sector is the ultimate in the response to the problem, but I think they can play a much more strategic role going forward in helping to organize and structure and plan these local governments and these central governments in a much more effective way.
Thanks. We can probably, with the audience, get much more into those questions on the relationship between public and private sectors. I wanted, though, to get Jennifer Bradley, who's the fellow and senior advisor, Metropolitan Policy Program, and co-director of the Great Lakes Initiative at Brookings Institution. I wanted to allow you to get into the dialogue here and talk a little bit on the community perspective. And I know you've done a lot of work, so kind of from the ground up, we've kind of gone down from the state private sector, and now we're actually going to hear the voices, hopefully, that you can help us read what they are saying about urban development.
Thanks very much. Again, like my fellow panelists, I'm very pleased to be here. One of the advantages of being a not subject specialist, I focus on domestic policy, not international policy, is I learn an enormous amount when I come to events like this. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to be here. One of the things that I think harmonizes what we've all said so far is that we're moving from a vision of cities as the problem to an understanding that cities and city regions are the solution. They are ways that you can spur economic development. There are ways that you can find out faster what kinds of delivery systems are appropriate. And I feel like that's something that's happening across the world. We certainly see it in the United States, particularly during the October unpleasantness that beset us in Washington. It was clear that cities and metropolitan areas in the United States don't have the shutting down is not a possibility for them. And we find that they are often on the cutting edge of policy development, solutions sharing, and frequently cities and metropolitan areas are opening their eyes to the possibilities of a rapidly urbanizing world. So, for example, in Portland, Oregon, the city has decided, the city and the region has decided that their kind of green, crunchy, groovy lifestyle is actually a potential export product. And they're working with people who provide engineering services and architecture services, and even the government, to say to rapidly developing cities, particularly in Brazil, if you would like to create a more sustainable set of institutions and policies and infrastructures, we can help you do that. So I think there's an enormous amount of potential for cities and city regions from the United States and across the world to connect and learn. I think one of the reasons that cities are able to have this, they're certainly not trouble-free, but I think that one reason they are able to be the source of solutions is that particularly when you look at the metro region scale, where you don't have a government that matches that geography, change happens through networks, the private sector, the public sector, non-governmental organizations. These are entities that are able to come together and solve problems. There's something about all working together in the same geography. People tend to know each other. The interactions between the different sectors tend to be a bit more fluid. And so we see, certainly in the United States, the power of networks. Again, CDCs, nonprofit organizations, new kinds of business and government intermediaries, taking control and creating a kind of beneficial change. One example I like to give, and again, this is drawing on my domestic experience, is the city of Detroit. My co-author, Bruce Katz, and I wrote a book called The Metropolitan Revolution that talks about the things I've been saying here. Cities are, oops, there goes my pen. Cities are, they're great, they're the source of so much potential, all these wonderful things are happening, and a month later, Detroit declared bankruptcy. And everyone said, this is a disaster for you. This is terrible, right? How can you say such great things about cities when Detroit has spectacularly flamed out? And actually, Detroit is in our book, and we talk about Detroit as an example of how even when a government is bogged down and unable to meet a lot of basic needs, you can have nonprofit organizations, you can have the private sector. There's one investor in Detroit who spent $1 billion on downtown office buildings because he believes this is a good bet. There are very dedicated people working in organizations like Midtown Detroit Incorporated. There are philanthropic groups like the Kresge Foundation, the New Economy Initiative for Southeast Michigan. There are the people who are leading anchor institutions like the Henry Ford Hospital and the Karamanos Cancer Center. They're all working together to create a genuine resurgence in the downtown and midtown area of Detroit. I raise that example again just to show that it's not all about what a particular government is doing. I'm not an expert in foreign policy, but it would seem to me that there are many examples around the world when a local government is perhaps not going to be the best partner for some of the aims that USAID would like to achieve, that a local government may be more exclusionary minded for certain groups of people as opposed to being inclusive. That, however, doesn't mean that nothing can happen in that particular geography, because there will likely be these other entities in the network, these NGOs, the wonderful people who are doing the mapping in Kathmandu, right? That's not a government project. That's relying on a group of people who want to do this for other reasons. I also think that this network effect could be a key to making more sustainable policy change. Certainly in the United States, one of the things that we find is, my colleagues and I will work with a governor, with a mayor, and get that mayor very excited about a particular policy, say a strategy to increase exports. Then that mayor either loses an election or leaves office, and the new mayor says, I don't care, export, that's that other guy's thing. My thing is, something entirely different. And so all the energy that went into that particular area of exports dissipates. Having somebody else who is also a partner in the export or whatever policy area you're talking about can give a particular policy some durability and sustainability that will carry through administrations. There are no guarantees, but I do think the vitality and the diversity of actors that you see in city regions is key to their success in solving problems, and the ability of city regions to look at each other across the world and share ideas and share solutions makes me very optimistic about the urbanization trends that we see going on and this kind of urbanized century.
Before we go to the audience, I just wondered if Steve or Alonso wants to comment on this network idea, which actually was another idea we had in the global trends about how you are, moving from more hierarchical structures to networks, actually. And I would totally agree. I mean, these are really very problem-solving, and they have wonderful uses. I think there is some, from a public sector point of view, there's some problems always in developing that public-private partnership. But I wondered maybe if Steve or Alonso, from your perspectives, would comment about how we can better use networks.
I'm suffering from a bit of schizophrenia here because I want to jump on Steve's answer, but I want to stay in the private. I'm going to stay in the private sector lane here. I think that there is, from an international perspective and from a development and sustainable perspective, there's no way that we can be successful in any of these countries without the local governments. And whether we believe we can work around them or not, I think many of the development professionals in this room will tell you at the end of the day, they're going to win. And I think we've got to figure out a process by incorporating them and making them part of the solution rather than part of the problem. I think that there is a much more of an education level. There's a need. They've got a great project in the Philippines right now that Gloria Steele is implementing on urbanization, which I think the agency should replicate, as well as other donors around the world, because I think that's going to help you get at the problem, and I think encourage the private sector that this is a place that we need to invest. And I know we throw this public-private partnership piece around quite a bit, but I think you have to have the balance of both the public and the private. You got to, and you recognize that a healthy majority of parties right now in countries are using public-private partnerships, but they're not calling it that. And I think that we have to find more quality, more reach, more efficiency, and think more effectively and innovative about how we implement these things, because I think that's going to be the long-term sustainability of what it is that we're trying to get done. And most importantly, I think we're trying to get to the last mile in some of these countries, especially in the emerging market countries. I think community mobilization, local NGOs, and existing structures are going to play a key role, and whether or not the private sector thinks it's stable enough to really put its dollars in those communities and in those programs.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think There's a couple ways to sort of think about it. I mean, I think certainly one trend that I think has been increasingly evident is the trend of decentralization, and I think that really speaks to the idea of working in the subnational level. So, you know, I think one thing that we can think about as we approach different contexts in different countries, it's not all about national ministries. It's not all about the central government. A lot of municipal governments are much more empowered these days, have much more latitude, and a lot more pragmatic. I think a lot of what Jennifer, you've mentioned in your book, it really talks to innovative partnerships and ways at the local level things can actually get done when you separate things out a little bit from the politics that sometimes infuse regional or national level sets of issues, whether it's in our own country or whether it's globally. So I think, you know, one trend that we're noticing and one trend that we can do more with is to really think about other actors within the governance space, within the public sector, that can be, I think, centers of excellence, areas of innovation, and can really benefit from the tools that we would offer. You know, I think the other part to that as well is to find ways through a networked approach, which I do think overall as a trend that you've identified, Matt, and will only continue to manifest itself going forward, is to think about innovative ways to incentivize different collaborations. And, you know, certainly we have a history of kind of working with both sides. You know, I think, Alonzo, that most of your career has sort of been both working directly with public sector actors, but also working very much with NGOs, civil society, and, you know, and certainly the private sector. So I think that, at least in some respects, from the USAID perspective, is one of the strengths that we can bring, and that we do have those relationships. We have a long history on both ends, as opposed to sort of picking and choosing necessarily and saying it's only one or the other. I think for us, it's a matter of going more local and finding ways to properly incentivize mutual collaboration between both entities.
I think that Steve put my point much more lucidly and elegantly than I did myself. By talking about the power of non-government actors, I'm not in any way trying to say that local governments or national governments are irrelevant or unnecessary. I think that, however, you also need all of these other actors, because the problems or the opportunities that you're confronted with when you are working at the city region scale are so they're so complex, they're so abundant, that there's not any one entity that has all of the resources, all of the expertise, all of the durability to confront them. So local government is an important part of this network. There are some places where local government may not be an ideal partner. And what I was getting at is, while entities are trying to work out the kinks with the local government partner, some things can be moving ahead with people who are in the other parts of the network. But certainly by saying that there are alternatives and partners to government, I did not in any way mean to minimize the great work that happens in local governments in the United States and elsewhere.
Well, let's open it up, and yeah, I think we have microphones, right? So, gentleman over there had his hand up first, I think.
Thank you very much. I had a question for the private sector in particular. It strikes me that one of the conundrums that the private sector always presents in any discussion is the idea of being minimizing risk. In other words, in most cases, not wanting to take risk. And yet, here we are at a point, I think, in the subnational level, where if we don't do the necessary experiments to which we do not know the outcomes, we will have nothing to pass on. Right. And so if you're risk averse to begin with, to invest in that, I don't fully grasp how the private sector plays here, given the circumstances and the nature of what we're about. Yeah. Thank you.
I think it's a good question, but I think also we have to recognize that at the end of the day, most of the companies in this country are recognizing where the growth is. So we recognize that our economy has been growing at about 1.X% over the last few years. Europe's going to be down for the next 5 to 7 years. And where's the world's growth? It's in Asia, 2/3 of the world's population is there, and in Africa. And I think a lot of the private companies have been playing the old tapes that it's not the right place to invest, it's not the right time, it's too risky. But they're watching Europe, the Germans, the British, Swiss, and others, Japanese, and the Chinese, doing very, very well in those places. And as the margins come down for U.S. companies domestically, they're now recognizing that emerging markets are the place to be. And they're now taking another look at evaluating that risk and looking at where they can provide a comparative advantage. And I think a lot of the larger companies, you see GE, not just Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is a world-class company, and they've been willing to manage that risk over the years and take losses, but also recognize they can gain it on the other end. And one of the reasons that CH Tullamhilla hired me was to help them work on how to enter some of those markets in a strategic way and to minimize their risk, and how do they bring their comparative advantage in water, climate, and environment, and sustainable energy to bear to deal with some of these complex problems. And I think what you'll find is a lot of the companies that are looking in that part of the world don't have the partnerships, and that's why I mentioned the local level and also the national level, that you have the relationships on both ends, and you have to have good NGO partnerships, and that's where the public and private piece, I think, are going to play a major role in the sustainability of these programs and projects that you're looking at on the infrastructure side, water and environment, climate perspective, and also sustainable energy. Everybody's moving to the city. Everybody's not going to be able to be on the grid. How are you going to find sustainable ways forward? Our traditional NGOs and our traditional aid partners don't have the bandwidth to do those kinds of things. So this is where the private sector can play a comparative advantage in some of these areas and partner in those countries to do it in a much more effective way, I think, going forward.
And I would also just add to that as well, I think there's a mutual self-interest in terms of the role the public sector can play in helping to either help change some of the risks, add risk mitigation or whatnot, and work together with the private sector towards mutually identifiable development objectives. So for us, if we sort of accept as a precondition of development that you need economic growth in order to reduce poverty, and we look to the private sector as a means to driving that, you know, there are many things that we can do, many instruments that we have that will change some of the risk calculations and incentives so that it makes more sense for private sector investors to potentially consider investing and coming into certain markets that otherwise might be viewed as too risky or too outside of the box in terms of their business model. So I think there's a role that can play and that's mutually beneficial towards some of that as well.
But I also think, if I could just add one more point on this, sorry.
We got other questions out
okay.
here, so
okay. Oh, go ahead.
I think we can.
Yep.
I'm going to take three and then ask the panel to choose which ones you want to. And if you don't choose all of them, then I'll assign them. But so I have one man here, yeah, and.
Just a quick comment. I'm a Romanian planner, 25 years in this country and 20 years with the World Bank.
There's a microphone right there.
Thank you. Romanian planner, 25 years in this country, 20 years with the World Bank, USAID, DFID, JICA, etc. I think I was one of the first to read your report, sir. I was in Romania in December. I spread the word, gave it to a number of local think tanks, including Gaspen Institute Romania and the Center of Excellence that I founded in Bucharest. I have a quick comment because I'm totally overwhelmed and delighted to be here and to see this initiative which comes after many years of planners waiting for this to happen. The comment is I couldn't agree more with the idea of networking to solve problems, of sharing best practices and greatest solutions horizontally between governments and local NGOs and things like this, with one word of caution, and that is context sensitive. I think it's extremely important to have a very clear awareness about the cultural differences, what works in one country, what doesn't work, and share all that information. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, on this side.
Thank you very much. I am from an agency at the United Nations, which is the United Nations Human Settlements Program, known as UN Habitat, and urban development is our focus. And it was good to hear this morning. Indeed, we have exactly the same views, although it's very difficult at the United Nations because we deal with so many sectors. It's very difficult to bring our voices. But indeed, we have come a long way. In the past, urbanization was indeed very negative, especially in Africa, with the effort. And we have not really convinced everybody, but they always say, we want you to help us keep people in the rural areas and they want us to work in the rural areas because they say that's where most of our population are. We do say that we try. I think we are getting there to say indeed that urbanization is positive, that it is the most efficient way actually to deliver basic services to people, that we need to have cities that are well planned, well managed, efficient, well coordinated, etc. Now, you were talking also about local authorities. On the global stage, in other countries, local authorities don't have the capacity, they don't have the resources. So we have also to think about how to build their capacity. Often they cannot even collect taxes. That's one thing. The other thing, yes, indeed, I think even at the UN, we are realizing the governments cannot do everything, the national government. And as you know, even local authorities don't have a role at the UN. They are not involved in decision making. They are part of other partners. So we're trying to come to bring that. But just to point out that we have actually developed some guidelines on decentralization and access to basic services, because indeed we realize that there are many partners, but we have to talk about what are the different roles. Because talking about the private sector, we also have a global compact initiative to ensure that also the private sector takes into consideration the needs and concern of poor people. So they have to abide by certain principles. But there should be also some kind of framework so the roles are well defined of all these stakeholders. Just to end, to bring to your attention, there is a Habitat 3 conference in 2016. That's when we will have the urban agenda. We hope to develop a new urban agenda. We hope you will participate. Right now at the UN, there is a whole process on post-2015, which is how to develop the new development agenda after the Millennium Development Goals, which end at the end of 2015. We need your voices because this will be done by, decision will be done by the national government. We need your voices to say, without urbanization, you cannot have sustainable development, and it has to be part of that development agenda. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Others? Yes, gentlemen here on that. And then then we'll go back to the panel, and then we'll come back.
Thank you. I'm the former director of the National League of Cities, and my question has to do with one that's been touched on, and that is governance and capacity. The challenge to me seems to be, how do you deal with the cultural differences, as this gentleman said, but also the traditions. A good example is the whole issue of patronage and the commitment to family, to networks of friends. And to me, the question really that I'm posing here is, what is the role and what is the strategy that's incorporated into the plan that you're putting forward to for USAID and for us to be able to impact or help support efforts to change that? I was recently involved in a training program in North Africa with local elected officials, and this issue is the most fundamental, the most difficult for them. And this was a group of people, this was paid for by AID, by the way. This is a group of people that are totally committed to trying to bring change, and part of what we were trying to do was empower them to realize that there are ways of doing something more than say, well, we're being, there are challenges that are more than we can handle. So my question is very simple. What is incorporated into the plan that you've developed, that we're developing, that can address this issue? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn to the panel. So we have one looking at the cultural context another one looking at how do you build local capacities, and then a third on actually also on the governance issue of how you really build commitment to implement the plan. Jennifer, do you want to take a stab?
I think that if you are looking for a diversity of approaches, going from metro to metro, as opposed to having conversations solely at the nation state to nation state level, will probably foster a greater range of solutions and will probably engage people at talking about the specific kinds of customizations that may be appropriate for Bucharest, less so for, again, Kathmandu or another emerging country. And I think that it's as important, what's implicit in your question is how do we learn from failure? And I think it is just as important to be able to make a space to learn from failure as it is from success. And I do think that just the diversity of solutions that you're going to get at different levels, even in the United States, we understand that it's very difficult to set policy that will be appropriate, policy about development that will be appropriate for the range of cities in the United States. So going to the local level seems to be a way to better respect diversity. So I can.
Okay. Alonzo, Steve, comments on that?
I'm going to stay out of that one. I'll let you take that one. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm in the private sector now.
Still so used to you.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think...
You also have to customize, presumably, bids and things that would... And so you understand the ability to sort and distinguish ways that projects will be successful in one sphere and not another, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. I do think this question on how you deal local, national level, I mean, we have very good comment here about the UN. I mean, if you're going to get the urbanization much more into the next set of millennial goals, how do you do that? It's obviously member state has the decision-making power on that, but it's actually much more at the city level or the local level where it's going to make a difference.
I think one of the things that has to happen is that we're having a conversation amongst ourselves here, and we're agreeing with each other violently about what needs to happen. And I think that it has to be a top-down as well as a bottom-up approach. And until you can make the governor and the president of the country and some of the key leaders in the economic planning ministry and the Ministry of Finance recognize that they got a train wreck coming, and here's why. And I thought the riots and a couple of the cities in Sao Paulo and others would have awakened a lot of these leaders to the point that, hey, I'm looking at my demographic numbers. How did Al-Shabaab and those guys get started? And we've got all these young people. We've got to figure out how we move our economic growth forward. And I think that's why the donors and also the private and the public sector have to be much more thoughtful about how we design programs and projects going forward. It just can't be business as usual, and I mentioned that in my opening. We've got to find a way to understand, A, that we don't know what we don't know, and that we don't have the expertise in-house anymore. Peter Kim, who ran the Rural Housing and Urban Development Office for many years in USAID, one of the most thoughtful civil servants that I think our country's ever had in this regard, really talked about how these things need to be done, and we phased that program out. There's a capability of doing these things, but we've got to have our leaders stepping forward, not just in a policy, but saying, you've got to deal with these issues. And then also we have to find the financing from Capitol Hill as well as in the existing programs to really address the issues. Because all we're doing right now is having a conversation. And until it becomes a priority of the mission director, the ambassador, and the country leadership, it's just a policy.
Thanks, Steve.
Let me address a couple of the questions here. Certainly, I have a few thoughts on the governance point, which was a great opening, actually, for a couple things. But for my UN colleague, I do want to say completely agree with what you said. We I think, as you know, are already in, I think, strong discussions with your team, both in terms of, our participation at the World Urban Forum, but also the 2016 event that you mentioned. So I think there's a great opportunity for that. But, we are also very engaged in the post-2015 process, in particular the Sustainable Development Goals. My understanding is that cities have now moved to the forefront as something that a lot of different member states are actively considering as a primary component in some form, for the SDGs. So I would actually encourage those in the audience, many of whom occupy fairly influential positions in the policy community, to think about very carefully what should that look like, how to inform that. I think briefers, papers, and whatnot, especially in the broader UN context, will play a really important role as those discussions happen, which I understand should really begin in more seriousness by early next year, and I'd be happy to talk to folks about what that potentially might mean. On the governance point, though, and this I think really actually goes to the question about how do different areas of our work intersect. We actually came out with a democracy, human rights, and governance strategy in June, and it pinpointed 4 areas that kind of get to, I think, the question that you mentioned. I think first it really talked about how to foster a greater amount of accountability, especially from citizens demanding accountability from their governments, and it really talked about looking both to technological solutions, but also a greater amount of involvement in political processes as one way to do that, with the whole understanding being that transparency and other sort of core principles should be a key part of how governance works. Second of all, it looked at the idea of inclusive participation. So it really brings together that accountability section and really says, how do you get involved at the local level or so forth? And what are some tools and ways we can help support that with our partners? Third is a human rights aspect to it, really thinking about human rights as a key component to our democracy agenda. And finally, there's a goal that talks to integration, and that says that you can't think of democracy, human rights, and governance as a standalone issue. It has to be something that is thought through, incorporated, whether you're thinking about global health programs and implementing those and making sure the community has an understanding of what's taking place, whether you're looking at Feed the Future or so forth. And that certainly is part and parcel of the whole idea behind the urban policy as well, that it is a platform. It is something that directly needs to associate with and speak to the governance issues. And that's the only way we'll get some success down the line.
Okay,
but I also
Steve,
think...
let's, we can continue that. We got lots of questioners out here. And so what I would ask, keep your questions short. And then we'll also ask the panel to keep their answers short, and then we can get through as many. First gentleman here. Yeah.
And I'm Chas Cadwell from the Urban Institute. This is a policy about service delivery in an urbanizing world, not just about cities. And the status quo, it seems to me, has incredible momentum. There are stakeholders in the bad context that we're all worried about, people who benefit from the way things are today. And so I appreciate your comments, Steve, about the DG, the democracy and governance part of this, because it seems to me that all these services are not just produced by cities, but in conjunction with national governments, regional governments that finance, set policies. We're just finishing some work for the bank on service delivery in Asian cities that shows local governments don't have any money, don't have any authority in many cases, and face interference from national ministries. So it seems to me a democracy agenda needs to address that shared political accountability, that no matter how much you invest in technology, is going to be a challenge. So I'm struck in your policy that there's a reference to democracy and governance, but not many tools that will help missions think through these, what are ultimately political questions. We can go on the web to get the technical answers, but the political issues are all very context specific. And so I guess my question is, AID is one donor of many, but it seems to me you've got unique capacity to address some of these issues. But how do you think about your role vis-a-vis some of the other more financially oriented donors in this field?
Good question.
Gentleman back. I'm going to take, let's say, up to 5 so we can get. And please introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, my name is Luke Bostrom with the Aga Khan Foundation. So coming at this from the NGO perspective, and this is a question for that actually just touching on something that Alonzo brought up in the last round, which is yes, we are all sitting here talking about it, but, the rubber meets the road at the mission level. And historically, missions haven't been supportive of urban work. I mean, Making Cities Work has been around for a long time. It's great to have a new policy, but how can we, and then how can we as the NGO community, and how can you guys as USAID kind of help promote urban work and actually putting some resources into doing work at the urban level in the missions?
Farther back on this side, any? Okay, we'll go over to this side. And yeah, man on the side.
Thank you again.
Short.
Anthony Sochi,
Oh, he's back.
EPA. Oh,
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry.
Just keep keep your questions short so we can get everybody.
it's real short. It has to do with the culture of USAID. It has a long-standing history of commitment to rural focus in its portfolio, and that still maintains insofar as I'm able to discern. How do you see the transition of that culture, given all of the trends and trajectories on the urban front?
Okay. Back there, we'll get to you.
Thank you. Andrew Preston with the British Embassy. I wanted to ask about the mission focus of the policy. And can you say a little bit more about the rationale for that? Because it strikes me that there's a lot that missions can do, but there's also a lot that can be done internationally and regionally. And I was kind of slightly surprised by that narrow focus.
Okay. So, gentleman here on the aisle, please say it.
Howard Sumka, formerly USAID. Quick comment on the private sector aspect and then a question. I think if you look at urban development as it's historically proceeded in the past 30 or 50 or 100 years, the vast, vast majority of resources have come from the private sector. It's not like this is something new, and perhaps that private investment has been opportunistic or ad hoc, and what we need now is something more strategic. But the point is the private sector's there, and the question is, what does the public sector do to facilitate and encourage private sector? When we were looking at slum upgrading issues in Asia and Africa and Latin America, we used to say that there were only three things the public sector really needed to do. Needed to make sure there was serviceable infrastructure, needed to make sure there was an environment that allowed private financing to happen, and it needed to make sure that there were tenure rights on land so people could actually use their land productively, and everything else would be taken care of by the private sector. I wrote that speech for Peter Kim in 1986. The question I have is, if you see it in that framework, what exactly does the USAID policy on urbanization focus on? And the question was picked up by a couple of others. The title, which is all about urban service delivery, seems to me means it's not about urbanization as a strategic way to encourage urban growth and to fit into the national development policy. And I'm curious how you see that.
Okay, we had another question. Yes, please. Right here in the front, second row.
Hi, Jeff Soul with the American Planning Association. And echoing some of the other comments, I have one comment. One is, don't forget spatiality. Technology gets too much attention in terms of sustainability, I think. It's important. But we have to look at settlement pattern. In Santiago, for example, people who live on the periphery have to spend 4 hours a day to get to services. So, second point is how to connect finance to the issue of transparency. I think budgeting has got to become a public data good, just like we saw in Kathmandu. We see plans, but we don't see it connected to finance. So I think that's a key issue that we need to deal with. Okay, I think we got quite a few there on the table.
quite a few, I think, for looking at AID in terms of how do you square it with the democracy, what's the commitment at the mission level, is that too focused a commitment, how do you work with the private sector, and how's the balance between rural and urban? So maybe we'll begin with you, Steve.
Sure, and I will just maybe make a general comment given the number of questions, but I'm happy to, of course, continue the dialogue afterwards. I think this is an ongoing issue. I think that the important context that's for this policy is really, when we went in, there was a lot of questions about what should we do with this policy. Andrew asked a good question about why it doesn't speak to kind of the broader global development issues. There were some questions about how it relates to missions, or why it was narrowly focused towards missions, or maybe it should be bigger. And really, our focus was we wanted to do something that put down a marker for mission directors and others to really signify that this is an issue that ought to be taken seriously, and that over the next 10, 20 years is something that needs to more and more be a part of development approaches in the field. And we felt that that was something that so far in the development discourse at AID had been lacking. So that was point one. Point number two is we wanted something that was narrowly focused enough and practical that offered potential tools that could be taken up so that immediate, even if there are smaller things, could be done right away that would produce real change on the ground. To that end, there will be a sort of secondary implementation guidance and a how-to note that will be developed by colleagues in E3 over here together with many other stakeholders, which will talk about specific tools and approaches that missions can take up and use, even if it's something like an assessment at the beginning to say, what are the key constraints? What are the key challenges? What are the opportunities and the tool and the resources available to the missions with partners to be able to accomplish and get at some of the big issues? But to us, that was a really important thing to do. That doesn't mean that that's to the exclusion of a wider policy discourse on the bigger issues of urbanization strategically affecting our development. I think that is something that will happen in parallel. But for us, it was picking and choosing and trying to really put together a document that could practically move the agenda forward together with our broader priorities, recognizing the reality that we operate in as an agency.
And Alonso, there was a question here on public-private partnership. Has it changed really that much? If you could provide some comments from your...
I think Howard hit it right on the head. It hasn't changed very much, but I think that what we've done as a nation in regards to implementing these programs, we've gotten so fixed on the solutions to some of the critical health issues in the country, where 50%, I believe, of all AID's budget goes toward health programs. And we've forgotten about that you need an integrated approach to sustaining the development within these countries. And I think going forward, and that's why I keep making the point that it's going to be done as a partnership. Everybody has to have skin in the game for it to work. And I think there are enough solutions and actual things that have worked over the last 10 years that you can come back to and really start to enact them. But I think our missions are distracted. I think that they have kind of lost the bubble a little bit on what's going to sustain these countries over the next 10 to 15 years, and it's not just the basic approach. And I think countries are asking for something different. And I think that's where you're going to find a lot of the private companies investing, where you've got the governance. If the governance piece is not right, you're not going to get the investment. I don't care how much you manage the risk, what the potential return will be. The last thing they want to do is have their program or project go south on them. In the end, I know there was a comment made about the fact that the rule, this argument or this struggle between rural versus urban. We can kid ourselves all we want and put our hands over our eyes and say they're really not coming, they'll stay out there on the farm. They're going to go where the water, where the jobs are, where the health care is, and those are the things at the end, sustainable energy. And if we don't figure out a way to help these cities plan in an organized way, we're going to end up with some real calamity on our hand. And that's why I said it's really a pressing national security issue for stability within the countries that we're working in as a nation, but also for the long-term investment to sustain what we've already achieved over the years.
Great. Jennifer, I'm going to give you the last word here. There was one question I thought gentleman asked about urban planning versus technology. And I don't know if you'd like to comment on that from your work and your perspective.
I think that we lose an enormous amount when we forget that technology needs to be in the service of a particular outcome. In that way, it's like infrastructure, right? We're not building we hope that we're not building a road because it's good to build a road. We build a road because it's important to get somewhere. And I think that technology has the power to do all kinds of amazing things. It's particularly useful with sustainability, but that's not the end in itself. And I think, again, as you get a larger group of technology users and people who care about the end result in the process, it will be easier to keep that larger goal in mind. And so that will also get you to spatiality issues, because it's where it is all happening. It's a question of quality of life. Are we going to make cities and city regions that are not just a result of economic necessity, but that are also places where people can flourish and the non-economic sides of their lives will also be tended to? And again, technology can be a tool in that, but if all we focus on is the technology, we lose the important human endpoint.
Well, obviously, we're just scratching the surface here, and you know, the turnout alone tells us in the Atlantic Council that this is a big issue, and a big issue that we actually need to explore with all of you. So thank you for coming, but also look forward to participation in future events and hopefully future cooperation, both with public, private, and the think tank world. So let's thank the panelists for their